Welcome back to Archaeology After Dark, everyone. I am, of course, your host, Daniel Rose. My guest today is Dr. Lance Greene. Lance, thanks for being here.
My pleasure. Thanks for inviting me.
Absolutely. So tell us a little bit about yourself.
Okay. So I grew up in East Tennessee around Knoxville. I got my bachelor's and master's degree from the University of Tennessee there. Then I did contract archaeology, CRM, for many years, and then went back to school and I got my PhD at University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. Since then, I taught for a while at American University in Washington, D.C. I taught at Georgia Southern University in Statesboro. And then for the last 7 or 8 years, I've been at Wright State University here in Dayton, Ohio.
So, what we're going to talk about today is marginalized history and how history lets things slip between the cracks and how archaeology can make up for that. So, Lance, a lot of your research and experience is with marginalized people. What does that actually mean in terms of history and archaeology?
So that's a great question. It's true that a lot of my research has been with marginalized people, mostly with indigenous groups in the Southeast or the Midwest of the United States in the 18th and 19th centuries. Also with some African American archaeology, African American history, and even a little bit. I worked for a few years on Camp Lawton, which was a Confederate POW camp in Georgia. And to me, one of the strengths of archaeology, especially historical archaeology, is that you can investigate and say more about the lives of people who didn't leave any primary documents, right? And so we look at marginalized people, whether we're talking about enslaved people or people working in textile mills or tenant farmers, or a lot of different groups of people that didn't have the chance to leave behind any written record, any information about themselves. And so, one of the things that really drew me to historical archaeology, and for years I focused more on prehistoric archaeology, was that archaeology has that power to look at, if you have a historic setting, but you have this lack of information, right, for certain groups of people, that archaeology can really come in and sort of fill that void. And so, whether, I'm looking at removal period Cherokees in Western North Carolina, or 18th century Shawnee folks here in southwestern Ohio, or other groups of people who didn't have a chance to leave any record behind, the archaeology can sort of democratize that history, right? We can start talking about those groups who have been forgotten. And the other strength of that to me is that, and I can talk more about the material culture and what that means. But to me, it also means that it's an opportunity to bring this kind of history of marginalized people to a broader audience, right? One of the great things about archaeology is that people are fascinated by it. There's this sort of immediacy, there's this urgency of looking at material culture, even maybe if you've read something about the Trail of Tears, right, in the 1830s. Seeing archaeological remains or seeing architectural remains of families who were actually swept up in the U.S. Army dragnet is really powerful. And so I think that's sort of an opportunity for archaeologists to start talking about some of these events, and for me, in American history, that haven't been very popular, that have been sort of overlooked in many ways, in sort of popular American history. Whether it's, the removal or enslavement, or, POW camps, things like that. And so it's an opportunity to sort of bring that kind of history back into the public sort of viewpoint, right? And so I try to use archaeology as sort of this entrance into, get people interested in the archaeology, and then start telling these sort of narratives and histories that have in some ways been overlooked, right? Or certainly are not very popular in this case, American history.
Yeah, and that's something that, we have a huge problem with. This is just my opinion in American history, is because something makes us uncomfortable, it makes us not want to talk about it. But doing that doesn't actually make things any better. Talking about the uncomfortable stuff is the only way to really understand it.
Yeah, I agree completely. And if you look at any history, including American history, there are things that are unpleasant. There are things that are uncomfortable to talk about. But I think that if you want to understand not only the history of a nation, but where people are at present day and where we might be headed, you have to understand those things, right? And so we can certainly look at the positive things in American history. We also need to look at those negative things. And so I think those uncomfortable histories have to be talked about and studied, and not only within the academy, but for the general public.
Yeah, and that's something, the general public doesn't even think about, is just because someone, isn't famous or spotlighted in history doesn't mean they're any less important. Like, say, George Washington compared to someone who's just an everyday blacksmith or textile worker. Both are figures in American history. It's just we focus more on one than the other.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that American history and the way American history is told is very similar to most nations, and that you certainly in this country we have, if you look at the number of history books or even archaeology books in earlier phases of archaeology, especially, you have certain themes that show up, right? You have the founding fathers, you have the elites, but they overlook, the 99% basically. I'm always sort of amazed. I teach an introduction to archaeology course at Wright State, and I always ask at some point how many people have heard of the Trail of Tears, and a few people have heard of that phenomenon, but almost nobody can really say when it happened or what it was exactly. And so to me, that just shows me what kind of gaps there are in the way students are taught about American history, right? And so again, archaeology is a great way to talk about all these different aspects of American history, and all those folks that have been left out of that history. Like you say, if somebody was an enslaved person or a blacksmith or a tenant farmer or whatever, doesn't mean that they haven't contributed to American history and that they're not a significant part of that history.
So, how do we as archaeologists go about giving, I guess, a voice to the people who have been left out or overlooked in history?
So that is a really great question. I think that archaeologists are working on and struggling with, and I think it has to do. I think it's closely connected to who is doing archaeology right now, right? Starting back in the 1960s and 70s and 80s, women sort of had to force their way into archaeology in this country because they had been kept out. And so you have more women in the field, but archaeology in this country at least is still mostly a white endeavor. And the reason I bring those things up is because I think that if you want to talk fully and accurately about marginalized people in the past, then we have to have a more diverse set of archaeologists doing work in the present to look at those, right, and in the future. And so I'm happy to see that. Again, I work mostly with Native American groups. You have more and more Native people who are being trained in archaeology, and they are staffing their own tribal historic preservation offices. I mostly work with the Eastern Band of Cherokee Indians in North Carolina, and they have a big staff of archaeologists and cultural resources folks who are tribal citizens and are professionally trained as archaeologists and other, anthropologists and other kinds of researchers. So that's fantastic. We're starting to see now a larger group of African Americans and Africans in the field. So for example, we have the Society of Black Archaeologists now. So I think that's an important shift in how archaeology is done, but it's gradual, right? It's happening very gradually. I've seen it happen gradually over the course of my career. But I think if we're serious about looking at marginalized groups in the past, and we want to tell that story, those narratives accurately and fully, we have to have those other voices, right? And it really sort of was brought home to me, I worked for a few years on Cherokee removal period farmstead sites in Western North Carolina, from the 1820s and 30s. And, we were working with primary documents that the Army had created. So we would find a farmstead site from 1835, and we would know the names of all the people who lived there because of the census that the Army created. And we can actually find their descendants living in Cherokee, North Carolina, or in Robbinsville. And so we would invite them to come out and observe and let us know what they thought about the work we were doing. And in many cases, they weren't trained professionally in archaeology or history, but they could tell us things about their ancestors. They could tell us things about, about the material culture, about the architecture that completely went over my head, right? And so I think if you have those kinds of collaborations, it makes that work that you do much more significant. And so I think, if we do want to expand, work on marginalized groups in the past, one of the key ways to do it is to bring in a more, train a more diverse set of archaeologists in the field.
Yeah, and that's one of the advantages of public archaeology. It's kind of a double-edged sword, but you can actually show what you found to the people. Like if you're doing a historic site in the middle of a city, people from the community can actually come in and see what you're looking at, and they can contribute to what you're showing them, as opposed to being out in the middle of, say, a swamp in the middle of Florida. You can't exactly invite the community out to see that.
Yeah. In some cases, it is difficult to do that, right? Depending on sort of the geographic setting and how isolated you are. But I think that serves the same purpose. I think, for example, when we do the field school here, we're here at Wright State. We've often worked at a site called Piqua, which was an 18th century Shawnee town just east of Dayton. And it was a battlefield in 1780. The American militia attacked it and burned it to the ground, basically. And so we've worked out there, but it's on a county park. And so when we work out there, I train the students to be able to chat with people. They're out on a hike. They may not even know that archaeology is being done. So they're curious and they come up and they chat with us. But I think that's also an opportunity, right, to do several things. Certainly to educate the public on the significance of archaeology, educate the public on their local history, but also to get input from them, right? They don't have to be trained in archaeology or anything like that. They can tell us about, local history, about what did the site look like 40 years ago, things like that. But certainly getting the public knowledgeable about how archaeology is done and why it's significant, I think is pretty crucial.
Yeah, and that's something that archaeologists haven't actually thought about until, well, I know COVID changed a lot of the way people look at public archaeology, but before then, people didn't actually give a lot of input or thought to input from the community while they were presenting archaeology to
them. Do you mean archaeologists weren't too concerned about input from the public?
Yeah, that's what I'm saying is they would publish something, but it was a very singular perspective. Like it was looking at it one way and one way only.
Yeah. I think that's been a trend in archaeology. Certainly when I started archaeology a few decades ago, that was much more the case, that's not all, but some archaeologists considered the work that they did academic and scientific, and that they were in charge of their research project, right? And that they didn't see any value in, or very little value in, engaging with the public, or certainly getting input from the public, right, or from descendant communities. And I think that has begun to shift, certainly, and it has changed since COVID. But again, up until COVID, I think it's been sort of a gradual shift. Certainly the last 20 years, I've seen that more and more archaeologists try to reach out to the public. They are aware that it's an important part of the job we do. But I think in the same way that trying to create a more diverse group of archaeologists, I think it's a gradual process that's been happening.
Yeah, and everyone keep in mind that change is slow, but change is happening, especially in the fields of history and archaeology, because people are changing the way they look at it because people are changing the way they look at it.
Yeah. Yeah. And you know, it always surprises me sometimes that archaeologists and other anthropologists can be sort of conservative in their field, right? I think when I started as a, you know, in the bachelor's program years ago at Tennessee, I had this image that all anthropologists were, you know, very liberal and open-minded and ready for change and things like that. And of course, that's not the case, right? You know, archaeologists are like other scientists, and we can be pretty conservative and try to protect our field and things like that. I think part of it is because we've been forced to make those changes. You know, the way you know, male archaeologists were forced to sort of embrace women in the field and in archaeology more generally back in the 60s and 70s and 80s, that they, you know, in the last 20 years, they've had to sort of change their view, and in some cases openly embraced it, but been sort of forced by the public, by descendant communities, by institutions, to sort of broaden the scope of how they do archaeology.
And honestly, those changes, in my opinion, have been for the better because the landscape of archaeology has changed to be more inclusive. It actually expands what we can learn archaeologically.
Mhm. Yeah, I agree completely. I think there, you know, there are a lot of examples of that. I think it's, you know, I think it opens up a lot of different kinds of opportunities and things you can learn through archaeology that were not available to us before that, right? I think about it the same way as, you know, when NAGPRA was passed back in 1990, I think some archaeologists and biological anthropologists sort of were afraid that that would be the end of their career because all the skeletons would go back into the ground, right? Which of course didn't happen. It's still a work in progress. But it's been the opposite, right? Archaeologists and bio folks who work with descendant communities now, or with, you know, other kinds of stakeholders, find in most cases that it sort of broadens the possibilities for the kinds of research that they do.
Yeah, and you bring up a good point. Archaeology is still a work in progress, people. We like to think that archaeology itself is a really, really old field, but the way we keep changing it, it's still new. It becomes something new every day.
Yeah, it is. It's a relatively new field. You know, when you talk about scientific fields, it's, you know, it's gone through, you know, different theoretical changes. And, you know, when I started doing archaeology, the field was still in the US anyway, was still in the middle of the processual, post-processual struggle, you know, and that's kind of shifted now theoretically how we think about doing archaeology. But now it's changing again, right? There are different kinds of major changes that are happening in the field. And part of it is, you know, who does archaeology and what kinds of collaborations do you have, and what are the goals and the outcomes of the work you do? You know, so I think that there's been a very big shift in the last decade or two.
Yeah, and that's something else that has shifted is people are less concerned about the outcome and more interested in the process of archaeology. They want to see what we're learning as we do it. They don't want to see the conclusion until we get there in a reasonable amount of time.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. That's a good point that you know, that final product, you know, whether your project is 1 year or 5 year, 10 years, whatever, you know, but the final goal is, whether it's a technical report or a book or a dissertation or whatever, right? And you're sort of, you know, you have blinders on while you're doing that, basically, is changing pretty quickly, right? And so, yeah, now I think it is much more about the process. It's about collaboration. You know, I continue to work with the Eastern Band and with the 3 different federally recognized Shawnee tribes in Oklahoma, and the focus is not on getting out in the field and moving as much earth as possible, right? That's shifted pretty dramatically.
Yeah, and that's something that I just thought of while I said it is anytime I go to like a regional conference or a presentation, most of the questions people ask aren't even about the conclusions we get to. They're about the process and the methods we use to get to that conclusion.
Mhm. Yeah, yeah, that's right. And I think the methods includes certainly the kind of work you do, the groups that you work with, but also I think also more of a focus on the ethical issues that you are engaged with in your research, right? And depending on what kind of work you're doing, of course, there might be different ethical concerns. But I think that there's a bigger focus on ethical issues in archaeology now.
Yeah, that's something that, anytime I go to a presentation or a conference now is there's always a panel specifically on ethics and repatriation because those are the issues that people think about now in archaeology. And,
Mhm.
2 or 3 years ago, that wasn't necessarily the case.
Yeah, yeah, that's absolutely right. And even not only with how we do our research, but things like sexual harassment in the field, right? And that's a very recent thing. I mean, that began. I can't remember how many years ago it was, like at the SEAC meetings, organization of panels to talk about sexual harassment, and it's in other conferences as well. But the fact that there are symposia and panel discussions about the ethics of how we work within our discipline, I think is a big shift as well.
Yeah, how we work and where we work, how we work, all of it is an ongoing question. It's something that we need to consistently ask ourselves as we move forward is what I'm doing acceptable to everyone?
Yeah. And it, I mean, that's a difficult challenge, of course. In some cases it is very difficult. And, I've never been directly involved in NAGPRA consultation, but I know that, I work with folks who have done it. And I know that consultation is a long drawn out process. Oftentimes, you're working with maybe 5 or 10 different indigenous nations. And so it can be a struggle, but I think that in all those instances, it's certainly worth it to try to undertake those things.
Yeah. So, Lance, we're about out of time. I like to wrap up each episode with a little bit of advice. So, anyone who's interested in archaeology, what advice would you give them?
Wow. Okay. Good question. So I would say, um, first of all, think about, how do you like to spend your time, right? What do you like to do? Um, how would you see yourself in the discipline of archaeology, right? So, for example, do you like spending a lot of time outside? Do you like getting dirty? Do you like doing repetitive tasks, right? Because in archaeology, we do a lot of the things over and over again, whether it's in the field or the lab. So try to find out, and if you can, if you're interested in archaeology, somehow maybe before you start taking courses or commit a lot of time to the field, right, or the training, try to get some experience. If you can volunteer on a project for a week or a couple of weeks or something like that, or maybe take a field school, to get a sense of what it's like, right? Because I think a lot of people who are interested in archaeology, they see it as one thing, and the reality of it is something very different. I've seen this with a lot of my students who take the field school, and sometimes they'll take it very early in their anthropology major. And in a lot of cases, they just love it from day one. And in some cases, from day one, they just say, oh my God, I hate this, right? I want to be in the lab, or I want to be I want to be where it's air conditioned. I don't like bugs. I don't, whatever it is. And so if you can get a little bit of experience and talk to an archaeologist and try to find out what that daily life is like, and just think about, is that something I want to spend the next 5 or 10 or 40 years doing?
Yeah, and something else that you could think about while looking into archaeology is it has a lot to offer everyone. If the program that's near you doesn't offer you something you're interested in, look at other programs. There are tons of things in the field of archaeology that if you don't find one thing interesting, you'll probably find another really interesting.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. The programs across the country vary dramatically, right? In the kind of experience you can work with, the different kinds of sites that are worked on, things like that. And also, I've had quite a few students who come into our program interested in archaeology, and we have a good public history program, and a good library special archives here at Wright State. And so I've had several students who are interested in archaeology, but then they discover public history or they discover archive, working in the archives, and then they shift over to that, right? So I think there are a lot of associated fields that are similar in some ways. If you're interested in the past or interested in history, that you can pursue that, but maybe archaeology isn't specifically the one path you want to follow.
Yeah, no one says you have to commit to archaeology. I mean, would we prefer it if you did? Absolutely. But we're not going to put your feet to the fire and make you be an archaeologist.
Right, right. Yeah, and also I think, don't put too much pressure on yourself. If you know you want to be in some related field like archaeology or history, um, I think that, for most jobs, certainly in archaeology, if you have a degree in anthropology or history or even geography or something like that, and a field school, then that's not going to keep you from doing archaeology.
No, I actually don't actually have a degree in anthropology or archaeology. All my degrees are in history, and
Mhm.
I've fit in perfectly just about anywhere.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. So, I try to get my students to calm down a little bit if they're too stressed, and say, this decision, if you're going to be a history or an anthropology major, does not affect the rest of your life, right? It's going to be okay.
Yeah, you have plenty of time to make other regrettable decisions outside of your academic career.
That's true. Yep. There's always an opportunity.
Well, Lance, thank you so much for joining me here on the program today. I really enjoyed having you.
Well, thank you. You're very welcome. I enjoyed it too.
All right, take care, everybody.
All right.